Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful Sunday morning. My name is Andrea Mosterman, and I will be moderating this session. We have, again, wonderful speakers, so I hope we can continue this conversation that we've been having over the past few days. I'm a historian of slavery in the Dutch Atlantic and early New York, and I especially look at spatial analysis, so it's been absolutely wonderful to hear all this great work that is being done on this subject and thinking about landscape and slavery, and I have no doubt that that will continue today. We have two wonderful speakers, so what I'll do is I will introduce them briefly, and then they will give their presentations. We will come back after that for a brief discussion, questions. I do hope that you will or I want to encourage you to enter your questions in the chat when you have them, even as they're giving their presentations. If there are any questions you have, share them so that I can make sure to address them and then hopefully include as many as possible toward the end of the presentations and during our conversation. So let me introduce the speakers for you. I will start with Melissa Blair, who is our second speaker. Melissa is a senior lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She is a historian of architecture, landscapes, and material culture with 20 years of experience gained at public history and academic institutions. She teaches the history of 18th and 19th century America and historic preservation. She is co-author of Washington and Baltimore Art Deco, a design history of neighboring cities, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2014. Her current research focuses on the Mid-Atlantic's rural buildings and landscapes, the farming patterns that shape them, and their preservation. And she will be talking, or a paper is titled Working Freedom, Black Farmers and Industrious Landscapes in Maryland from 1866 to 1880. And then our second speaker is Everett Fly, who is a native of San Antonio and resides there currently with his wife, Rosalinda, an honors graduate of the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. He is the first African-American graduate of Harvard's University Department of Landscape Architecture. He's a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. He has consulted for the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He also served on the State of Texas National Register Board of Review and City of Antonio Historic and Design Review Commission. He has chaired the Board of Humanities Texas from 1993 to 1994. And he served appointments by President Bill Clinton to the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities from 1994 to 2001. President Barack Obama awarded him one of the 10 2014 National Humanities Medals for his body of work preserving the integrity of African American places and landmarks. Recent awards include the 2018 San Antonio Power of Preservation Foundation Champion of Preservation Award, and the 2020 Conservation Society of San Antonio Texas Preservation Hero Award. He co-founded the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, and he will be speaking about muted place and free settlement icons. So without further ado, Everett, I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to the School of Design for inviting me to participate in this. It's really an important event, and I want to thank all of you who have risen with us this morning, given up your Sunday morning to listen to us. I hope some of you got to hear, or many of you got to hear, Michael Twitty's keynote that started off this event. I couldn't hardly sit still listening to him, and I could have listened to him for another couple of days, but he really put his finger on a number of really important aspects of slave landscapes and the way they transcend into our modern lives and culture. My work over the past 40 plus years has dealt with historic preservation of African American settlements. And I've had the opportunity to work with settlements across the United States. And it seems like, especially the more autonomous settlements, really have really strong relationships and connections to slavery. As Michael noted in his keynote, this aspect has been overlooked and suppressed. I use the term muted because, just as Michael pointed out, these physical representations, cultural rituals, traditions, and customs have been with us all along. It just seems like a lot of people weren't listening, and the oppression was so strong that it kept the voices quiet, but they're rising. And I want to encourage the audience and those of you in the planning and design and the activist community to work as much as you can, because this is a really important aspect of our culture, and it's disappearing quickly. In my work, I have kind of developed a typology, and interestingly enough, as I worked with the autonomous communities, I kept coming back to the slave origins, and I'll touch on it as we go along. But it's excruciating to try to document this because these folks didn't have voices; they were chattel or property, and most of the time they were only acknowledged that way. But there is some documentation. A lot of it is parallel, a lot of it is coincidental, but the pieces can be put together to help us understand and interpret slave influences and extensions into modern settlements. But this map right here at the top center is an 1877 map of the Mississippi River, and if you look closely, you can actually see the divisions of the plantations. And because this is a military map, it actually has structures here and here and here, and of course this is the river here. And this particular map, there's even a railroad that runs through. And when you look more closely, for example, this area here is blown up here. It turns out that this is the main house, and these would have been the slave quarters. When you look here on the map, you see in this blow up, the main house is separated here from the slave quarters here. And then when you look at the example here on the right, it's blown up here, and you can see the main house is closer to the slave quarters. And you can see that the slave quarters take on different configurations. Many of the plantations, and this doesn't say that this map represents every case. There are many variations from the deep south to the northeast. Someone recently sent me some documentation on one of the largest slave owners in Massachusetts. But this map gives us clues as to how these slave quarters would have been laid out. And then when you use other types of documentation, oral histories, the slave narratives, different accounts, again, military records and so forth, you begin to realize that there was a lot of living, a lot of cooking, a lot of industry that took place outside of the little cabins. And so the landscape starts to become a place for industrial work, processing, even rituals, even spiritual and religious ceremonies outside and beyond the cabins. A couple of examples that I want to give you as reference, and it just coincidental. It shows you how some of us who are researching this, our minds and our thoughts and our examples run parallel. This is the Arlington estate in Virginia. This is you can see here at the bottom of the slide, I believe it's an 1864-65 map. Many of you would recognize this. This is the Arlington estate where Arlington National Cemetery is located now. And this is the estate of the Custis Lee, as in Robert E. Lee and George Washington Parke Custis family. But this map labels slave dwellings here, slave dwellings here. And there's even on this map, it says colored school. And so, again, you can see the garden identified here and the garden identified here on the plan, which those of us who are planners would understand that this layout gives the slaves direct access to the house, but it also gives them immediate access to these gardens here and here. Coincidentally, I was able to find this set of maps again in the military records. I was able to talk about this about a year ago when I gave a talk for the Graduate School of Design. This became Freedmen's Village. Many of the freed enslaved people, when they were leaving because of the Civil War, went to Washington looking for refuge, and eventually many of them were located here in what they called Freedmen's Village by the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And again, these illustrations here and here are military records. This one shows what became the center of what they called the village, the center of the village. And it's actually located, this blow up is right here on this overall plan. The village included an orphanage, a school, a folk home for elderly folks, and a type of a hospital. And then you can see the Potomac River here and the crossing over to Washington, the monumental part of Washington, D.C. here. But across the river, here's the Potomac River again. Here's Freedmen's Village. Those of you who know Washington, D.C., across the river, the eastern branch, which is here, was Berry Farms was established. And both of these developments were for former enslaved persons, again, on the Potomac, the western branch, and on the eastern branch of the river. The layout of the properties was anywhere from an acre on up, and it gave these folks opportunities to build their own homes, establish their own communities. This inset map down here on the bottom left shows you, this is about an 1834-35 military map, but the circle right here shows you where Berry Farm eventually came to be located, and the X right here shows you where Freedmen's Village, and then of course the monumental, the main part of Washington, D.C. Is located here. The two documents on the right coincidentally show the cemetery, one of the cemeteries that was located or is located in the Berry Farm subdivision. And Ms. Alcione Amos has been able, at the Smithsonian in Anacostia, has been able to locate the roster, the cemetery roster that gives the names of the folks that are buried here. And many of them are former enslaved people. I want to move quickly to the one of the things that I discovered as I worked with these communities. These are just two, but as I worked across the United States, this kept coming up again and again, that Um, many of these people were simply not field hands. They had command of crafts and trades and even skills today that we would call city planning. So the inset at the top left is wood flooring that a group of former enslaved people made by hand for a church. The top center is shingles that they made for the church. The top right shows you the framing. It's amazing to see how these folks were able to work out the framing. Today an architect would go to a set of tables and look for load capacities of beams and how big are the beams, etc. These people did this from experience, and then they also planned and designed the footing that you see here, and then the close-up at the bottom right, the close-up of the footing. They were able to learn how to mix and make concrete from native sand, lime, and potash. And then the photograph at the bottom center is a masonry structure in Kansas. It's what remained of the Mount Olive Cemetery in Nicodemus, Kansas. And then the illustration at the bottom left shows you, for comparison, these are modern nails on the right side of the tape measure, but on the left, these are hand-wrought square nails that black African-American blacksmiths made to assemble this church, and anywhere from 1 penny to 6 penny size nails. And so the community components that come out of these slave villages and slave settlements include religious structures and cemeteries and burial places at the top left. Education was very important. So one of the first structures after the church and the cemetery would have been the schools. At the bottom left is an African-American citrus and pineapple farmer, believe it or not, in Florida. And then, of course, public and community space was important. And this is a view from on the right, bottom right, from Berry Farms. Just two examples that I want to use to show the evolution and the extension from slavery to freedom. One is Hobson City, Alabama, and this is of course, this is a map that shows the general location. Here is in the middle of the map is Birmingham, and then the X at the right is where Hobson City is located, near Oxford and Anniston, Alabama. Hobson City was established in 1899 by former enslaved people. But one of the first things they did at the top, you see, is establish a school. This is the school that it would appear today. The original school was a wood frame structure and was built on this site and grew and evolved to what you see there at the top right. They built their own homes, bottom, the middle left, center. They built their own churches, middle right. The bottom left shows, it's about a 1905 or 1910 photograph of a public park that was part of the town's landscape. And the image at the bottom right shows the outline of the park. It's more than 100 acres. This park turns out to be extremely important because in Alabama, at the time that Hobson City was established and even into the 20th century, an African-American person could be arrested for loitering and put incarcerated. But if you stopped at Hobson City, because it is an incorporated community, the mayor's black, the sheriff is black, the fire chief is black, the town council is black, they would allow you to stop at the park and rest or picnic or whatever without being arrested for loitering. The other example that I want to use, and again, these are just two, there are many variations across the United States, is Mound Bayou, Mississippi. And some of you might have heard of this, the community. It has an extremely interesting history. The Montgomery family were enslaved persons by the Joseph Davis family. And Joseph Davis was the older brother of Jefferson Davis, who eventually became the Confederate president. Their plantation was 5,000 acres. The Montgomery family were slaves on this plantation for about 30 years until emancipation. But during that time, Benjamin Montgomery and his son Isaiah learned to manage the plantation. And so they ran the plantation store. They did surveying work because the plantation is located on the Mississippi River. And they also did mechanical work as the plantation evolved, and the Davis family bought machinery. They learned how to service that machinery, and they did what we would call architectural drawings for the plantation buildings. When they were emancipated, they moved northwest and established the town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi. And these are some of the structures at the top left that were constructed in the town. At the bottom right is Isaiah Montgomery's his actual house, but the community made contributions at the top right. There were blues musicians that came out of this community. They developed their own hospitals. That's the photograph at the bottom left. So the legacies of these communities, you can see, is very broad. Oral and community history at the top left. Top center, of course, is preservation and stewardship of an entire community. At the top right, crafts and different craftsmanship. The two at the center, the two illustrations at the center, have more to do with community education and civic space. At the bottom left is documentation. There are sources of documentation for these communities. At the bottom center, many of you have seen the issues that have come up recently across the United States of uncovering burial grounds and so forth. Many of these are disconnected from the original plantations that where they occurred. And then at the bottom right, gardening and landscape work. So the legacies continue with us, and it's important for us to work in an interdisciplinary manner, and it's important for us to share the way we're having this discussion today. Again, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to give you this broad brush exposure, and I'll look forward to answering any questions that you have coming up. I believe the next presenter is Melissa, and I'll yield the floor to her. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Everett. It's a pleasure to be here and truly an honor to share a panel with you. I have a non-COVID respiratory infection right now, so please bear with my coughing, which will start around my 5th or 6th slides, which I'm ready for now, Matt. My talk tells the story of Black farmers in Maryland's Piedmont and explores the buildings and landscapes they created. I show how families used highly diversified agricultural strategies and small-scale household production to buffer the challenges of white supremacy and racial violence during the transition to freedom. Post-bellum, rural Black Marylanders became active participants in the industrious revolution. I argue that they were responsible for extending that revolution as it began to fade in other places and for other groups. Oops. Let me begin by thanking Jason Green, fifth generation descendant of Quince Orchard, Maryland, who called me into this history. There he is on the left in the blue shirt. The photo gives you a sense of what a people magnet he is. Elsie Thomas, third generation descendant of Martinsburg, Maryland, led me deeper into this story. That's her sitting on the church pew, unrelenting, even in a pandemic, in her effort to preserve her community. May my words honor them and the legacy they embody. This project uses archival records such as maps and agricultural census data, and also some oral history. But it builds on the work of scholar field workers who began investigating this part of Maryland over 4 decades ago. Without George McDaniel's groundbreaking survey work in the late 1970s, it would be nearly impossible to uncover the full extent of these Black farming towns. And it will not surprise you to hear that Everett Fly has traced this very ground. I suspect it would be quicker to map where Everett has not been than to map out all the places he has been. September 1873, native Marylander Frederick Douglass stood before a crowd of Black farmers in Nashville. I could far more easily tell you what I don't know about farming than what I do know, though the former would take more time to tell it than the latter. He followed that classic Douglass self-effacing opener with profuse, detailed, practical suggestions for how Black farmers could succeed despite scant resources and ongoing white malice. He exerted his audience to consider their success as farmers as central to the destiny of their race. It is the question whether we shall advance or recede, rise or fall, survive or perish. His was an optimistic agricultural vision where Black industriousness and the grand old earth that had no prejudices against race, color, or previous condition of servitude could conspire to repair the damages of slavery. We can work, and the grateful earth yields as readily and as bountiful to the touch of Black industry as of white. We can work, and by this means we can retrieve all our losses. What are industrious landscapes? Economic historians have argued that during the long 18th century, a growing number of families in Northwestern Europe and British North America took up new forms of economic behavior that spawned an industrious revolution. To put it simply, people worked more, produced more, and acquired more, and that change happened at a household level. It follows that what happened in and around houses was important. I call the resulting physical manifestations of this activity industrious landscapes. In the North American context, scholars have viewed people of European descent as the main actors in the industrious revolution. Indeed, white people reaped the vast majority of its benefits, many of them relying on enslaved and exploited Black labor to do so. Generations of white Marylanders worked feverishly to participate in the industrious revolution. Household goods and marketed foods produced in and around their homes as a central means of tying into the expanding Atlantic economy. Maryland's Piedmont is the place where two major colonial regions, the Chesapeake and southeastern Pennsylvania, knit together. I'm simplifying, but tobacco and slavery spread north from the Chesapeake. Cereal, crop, and livestock production spread south from Pennsylvania. Tobacco didn't fully stick, slavery did. By the antebellum period, this region emerged as the northern margin of Southern slavery, but with a farming system more aligned with the North. A traveler to the region would have seen a landscape dense with substantial farmhouses and large bank barns. But the industrious revolution had also produced other small-scale landscape features, countless outbuildings, gardens, orchards, and woodlots. Investigating industrious landscapes draws our attention to aspects of the built environment that have not been recognized as the economic and social drivers they historically were. Structures associated with food, its processing, preparation, preservation, and storage were key features of industrious landscapes. Architectural historians use the term domestic outbuildings to clump together the kitchens, spring houses, dairies, smoke houses, butcher houses, breweries, bake ovens, root cellars, ice houses, dry houses, and other small buildings in the vicinity of the main farmhouse. I don't really like the term domestic outbuilding because that word domestic makes us think we're separated from the world at large, and that could not be further from the truth with these structures. Simple at first glance, these are sophisticated pieces of vernacular engineering, precisely designed to provide not only a year-round food supply, but marketed farm products. Additionally, gardens, orchards, and woodlots were essential to industrious strategies and were integrally linked to the domestic outbuilding landscape. White farmers owned the buildings shown here. But it is not at all a stretch to say that Black people constructed, and in some cases even designed, many of Maryland's domestic outbuildings. Certainly, much of the knowledge of how to properly use these buildings resided with Black people. For example, the 18th century brewery / spring house pictured top center was a component of Monmouth Farm, a site mired in decades of enslavement. The building's close proximity to a stone quarters indicates who worked here. And I took this photo in 2014, sadly, right before this building was demolished. Across the Piedmont, we know enslaved women in particular played a major role in the dairying and brewing activities that helped the industrious revolution to churn. Though the majority of Black Marylanders toiled in agriculture, very few, of course, owned farmland prior to the Civil War. Free Black acquisitions were extremely modest, usually just a few acres, and only rarely approaching a county's average farm size. But despite their rareness and smallness, free Black-owned homesteads were vital places for myriad reasons, one being they were the seedbeds of Black industrious landscapes. Landscapes that gave rise to postbellum Black towns, buoyed families through the tumultuous post-war decades, and created practices of everyday life that persisted well into the 20th century. The demographic landholding and agricultural production patterns in a single election district in Montgomery County reveal how free Black families leveraged small and not so small holdings. In 1860, the Medley district was nearly evenly biracial. About 1,700 white people, 1,600 enslaved people, and 67 free people of color. And I'll stick with the census's language, free people of color, as there were indigenous people in the area as well. There were 204 total farms and 172 enslavers. So this is not perfect math, but it tells me that many of the district's farms were sites of enslavement in 1860. The 67 free people of color lived both in white households and independently. 10 white households had free people of color living in them. There were 9 independent free Black households. Of these 9, only 4 included Black landowners. Only 2 of these 4 landowners were classified with the occupation of farmer. As early as 1813, James Spencer acquired 50 acres in the Medley district. In 1846, Elijah Ockard acquired 37 acres. The Ockard and Spencer families built farms amidst a landscape of slavery and laid down the roots of the postbellum Black settlement of Big Woods. By the Civil War, Elijah Ockard had increased his farm to an incredible 163 acres, which was about the statewide average farm size at the time, a highly unusual achievement. Map makers Martinet and Bond noted the Ockard homestead on their 1860 map, and you can see Ockard's name underlined in red next to the big D. In 1860, a census taker determined that the Ockard and Spencer homesteads were substantial enough to warrant inclusion in the Census of Agriculture. That was a separate schedule from the population census that was used to collect agricultural data, including acreage, livestock, crops, and other farm products. On their 50-acre farm, the Spencer family had a horse, a couple cows, a couple pigs. They grew Indian corn, oats, and Irish potatoes, and they produced butter. The value of animals slaughtered categories, which you may be able to see there at the bottom, indicates they were preserving meats, and I had no doubt that they would have had a smokehouse of some sort. On the larger Auckland farm, the tabulated production was more robust. Their livestock was valued at $660. They had 6 horses, multiple cows, many pigs, and a whole herd of sheep. They grew substantial amounts of wheat and Indian corn, along with rye, oats, potatoes, hay, and clover seed. They produced wool, butter, and preserved meats. Note the tallied homemade manufacturers. It's small, but it's there. Any of the farm products listed in the census could have been sold for cash, bartered, or consumed on the farm. Choosing what to do with all they produced was likely a fluid decision-making process that changed seasonally and annually, one that was attuned to the needs of the moment. And census data did not capture all of the industrious strategies occurring on Maryland farms. For example, the 1860 census did not pick up poultry or products from orchards, gardens, and woodlots, as later censuses would. We can be sure Black farming families worked much harder and produced more farm products than federal records ever captured. And we're only, of course, seeing a sliver of the overall Black experience in this record set. Farming pioneers like the Ockards and the Spencer families used industrious strategies, including buying, increasing, and improving their farmland, and expanding their inventory of marketable products, and in doing so, broke ground for others soon to come. Black Montgomery Countyans spent the Civil War living directly in a war zone. The early Union disaster of Ball's Bluff happened right across the Potomac River from the Medley District, and the Confederacy was no abstract threat. There were numerous cavalry invasions into Montgomery County, and in 1862, Robert E. Lee crossed the Potomac into the Medley District at White's Ford. The Ocker and Spencer families could hear and possibly see 40,000 troops moving across the farmland in the name of a new country founded on the right to eternally enslave Black people. In 1863, again, Lee and the Army of the Potomac marched right past these farms on their way to Pennsylvania. But freedom came to the Medley District in 1864 with the passage of a new state constitution. After the war, land was a prime and immediate quest for free people all across the South. Black people in Montgomery County fared somewhat better in this pursuit than in other places, including nearby Southern Maryland. A single post-war acquisition could help establish an entire community. In 1866, Nathan and Ann Naylor purchased a little more than 81 acres in the Medley District for $1,141.60. The deed clearly says they paid in full. Though their farm was relatively modest, quickly the Naylors leveraged it so that a Black community could emerge. In 1867, the Naylors sold a 60 by 60 foot parcel of their farm to the trustees of the colored school, of which Nathan was a member, for $10. Soon they parceled off small acreage to at least 2 other families, charging roughly the going price. The need for cash could certainly have been a consideration, but it seems likely that the land sales were more about establishing a place for others than making a profit. The area developed into the town of Martinsburg. Census enumerators did not include the Naylors in the 1870 agricultural census, nor did they include the Ockard and Spencer families in Big Woods. This is surprising because all 3 families maintained relatively substantial acreage in 1870 and certainly were working the land. But the handful of Black farms in the Medley District that were recorded provide a sense of how Black industriousness continues as a strategy in the post-Bellum years. Thomas Jenkins of Martinsburg owned a small farm that barely cleared the bar to be included on the agricultural census. And we must read between the lines of his small-scale corn and pig farming to envision the range of activities that filled the Jenkinsons' days. In contrast, Basil Coates of the town of Sugarland had a 400-acre farm valued at $4,000. Production on this extraordinarily large Black farm compared to well-off white farms in the region. In addition to bountiful fields of grain and tobacco, the Coates' homestead lot would have bustled with the production of orchard products, butter, and preserved meats. At a small and large scale, Black industriousness was a growing force. Wow. In 1880, the Census Bureau was gathering a dizzying amount of information about the nation's farms. This is a tremendous resource for revealing expanding Black industrious landscapes. For instance, census takers decided to come back to the Ockard farm in 1880. Evidence of hard work and rising levels of production were observable across the now 240-acre farm valued at $2,000. I'm not going into the details, but this 1880 census reveals that the Ockards and others in the district were engaged in major poultry and egg production, prepared orchard products, and cords of wood for sale, all while running a major cereal crop and livestock operation. What did emergent Black industrious landscapes look like in the fragile years of the postbellum? By the late 1870s, there were at least 5 Black settlements and villages in the Medley district. Each community was unique, but unifying patterns emerged with regards to locationality and spatial patterns, such as clustering. Living in close proximity to other Black families made a great deal of sense, both in terms of security and facilitating mutual aid practices. I have yet to uncover a truly isolated postbellum Black farm in this area. Variations between one Black town and another were sometimes the result of whether the community was established before or after the Civil War. Black communities with antebellum roots developed an overall neighborhood pattern that was more dispersed. Big woods, which formed around the Ockard and Spencer farms, exemplify this pattern. Here, the date 1813 marks the Spencer farm location, and the date 1846 marks the Ockard farm, neither of which are extant. At least 7 Black families joined the community soon after emancipation. No one laid out a grid of streets. Instead, they steadily and possibly stealthily acquired plots along the neighborhood's 3 roads. These holdings were much smaller than the Ockard and Spencer acquisitions, usually not more than an acre. But from a bird's eye view, the results were a dispersed pattern of small homestead lots. And we have George McDaniel in his work in the 70s to thank for this survey data. Certainly by the 1890s, when the area had more than 20 Black homesteads, Big Woods presented as notable Black space. Florence Hallman described the town's early 20th century appearance to McDaniel. She described how the entire area was largely cleared primarily so that it could be worked, but it must have provided a measure of security to be able to look over to a neighbor's home. Hallman also recalled houses surrounded by tidy yards with a suite of outbuildings behind them, meat houses, privies, hen houses, and hog pens, as well as vegetable gardens and fruit trees. In other words, well-articulated Black industrious landscapes. Black communities formed whole cloth in the postbellum, exhibited denser and tightly developed neighborhood patterns. In the Crossroads village of Martinsburg, lot sizes ranged from about less than an acre to 10 acres. Most families had 4 acres or less. Everett, using your typology, I would place Big Woods in the category of rural settlement and Martinsburg in the category of rural village. But perhaps you can let me know if I'm splitting hairs. Martinsburg's earliest homes were simple log construction, 1 to 1.5 stories in height. But a preference for a 2-story house emerged among those who owned their land. Outbuildings, including stables, meat houses, hen houses, milk houses, and privies, were highly prevalent on these homesteads. Less substantial landscape features such as pig pens, gardens, wells, and improved springs, fences, and farm lanes were also common. The Hood Herbert House is one of the last historic Black homesteads still standing in Martinsburg. The heart of Black towns were small lots containing churches and 1- or 2-room schoolhouses, and often community halls and cemeteries, as Everett showed us. These sites were nodes of security, places for community building, and centers of mutual aid. The closeness of the schoolhouse, hall, church, and cemetery reflect how from childhood to old age, members of the community spent much of their everyday lives at these essential places, learning, socializing, worshiping, and remembering loved ones and ancestors. These gathering sites did not necessarily occupy a central location as they might in a New England village. They were often carved out on whatever land was available. For instance, the Nailers provided land for a school for Martinsburg, which was remote from any improved road. They also built a church carved out of their farm. In time, the church and school moved down closer to the busier crossroads that defined Martinsburg. The community took the extraordinary step of moving the first church building approximately a mile with the aid of log rollers and a team of oxen. Oops. Sorry. Martinsburg was initially a biracial village, but it became Blacker over time. In 1879, roughly 15 Black and white households were interspersed. The people of Martinsburg did create a clearly observable town, not with all its civic amenities and street patterns of nearby all-white Poolsville, but a linear arrangement of home lots, a church, a school, community hall, post office, blacksmith, and 2 stores. A few Black men living close to the center of town had occupations other than farm laborer and farmer. The 1880 census listed James Reed's occupation as country store, evidence of his either owning or keeping one of the town's 2 stores. Both the 1870 and 1880 census listed John Peters, pictured here, occupation as blacksmith. By the end of the 19th century, Martinsburg had upwards of 40 Black homesteads. To the south and west of Main Street, Black families had created a cluster of 1 to 2 room log or frame houses around a large wetland. Oral tradition reveals that this area or neighborhood within the neighborhood was known as the Mash. And you can see it there. If you see the sort of blue blobs below Martinsburg, that's the marsh. The wet ground on which they were built contributed to the eventual loss of these homes. The more substantial 2-story frame houses, such as the Hood-Hubert house, would endure much longer, their survival based in part on continual industrious strategies. Descendants of the founders of Big Woods and Martinsburg stayed in the area, worked the land, and produced a wide variety of farm products, both for home consumption, trade, and sale. Elsie Thomas, whose great-grandparents helped found the town of Martinsburg, recalls growing up in the 1940s and 50s on her family's 4-acre homestead, carved out of the original Naylor farm. The family raised hogs and chickens, had multiple types of fruit trees, and a large garden in which they grew corn, cabbages, kale, beans, lettuces, and many other vegetables. They stored onions, sweet potatoes, and white potatoes in root cellars for winter months. The only food they had to buy from the store was flour. The family worked hard and prepared the next generation for success off the land. Listening to the living descendant communities taps direct memories that stretch all the way back to the 1920s. At age 103, Ida Green, she was on one of my opening slides, can still share stories of growing up in this area. But as Michael Twitty and other speakers have shared with us, the memories they're tapping into reach back much, much, much further than even the 1920s. I will close now with just a quick word on the preservation of Black landscapes in Maryland's Piedmont. At no point in their history were Black industrious landscapes secure. Each generation faced challenges their white neighbors never endured, from the brutal lynching of George Peck just 4 miles west of Martinsburg in 1880, to the more day-to-day violence of constrained opportunity and denied civil rights in the Jim Crow period and beyond. This pressure ensured that for every awkward family who could make their farms pay and expand, there were countless more families who never acquired land or who did but were pushed off their small holdings. Today, Maryland is losing all of its remaining landscapes at a fast-clipping pace, but Black landscapes are particularly fragile. Little survives of Big Woods or Martinsburg. The Warren Historic Site in Martinsburg is one survival, but the few descendants still in the area were hard hit by the pandemic, and the site's leadership now worries how the site will survive and for whom. Racial violence still threatens these places. A month before Donald Trump's victory in 2016, white supremacists vandalized the historic Ashburn Color School in Northern Virginia. This was 7 miles as the crow flies across the Potomac from Martinsburg. We have lost far more Black landscapes and buildings than we have saved. In 1979, George McDaniel urged that the Martinsburg's Loving Charity Hall be a top preservation priority. Over the next decades, lack of internal resources and lack of external support brought the building to a point of no return. This photo down towards the bottom right doesn't even show the most advanced deterioration. And despite my preservationist obsession with original historic building materials, I do think the hall's recent reconstruction is a very bright spot. And anyway, I'd like to quote Everett, and this I'm taking from the newspaper article on the top right. Longevity on the land is just as significant historically as having a building that dates back to the original settlement. Though it has dwindled in Montgomery County, there is still longevity on the land. A new generation of descendants is delving into their ancestors' stories, the pain and the joy. They may not be farming, but they are working industriously to reach wider and wider audiences with transformative ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Everett. That was wonderful. I look forward to the conversation. I mean, there's so much here and so much overlap. What I would love to hear a little bit more about is how these communities changed from, before and after emancipation. If you see particular changes happening because of those differences, and I'm also wondering what these communities meant to Black people in the region. Really more so, the symbolism of these communities. I don't know how much you've looked into this, but I'd really love to hear some of your thoughts on that to get us started. I don't know who wants to start, but go ahead.
Well, I thank you, Melissa, for all those references. I forgot about some
you were
of those.
There.
Yeah, I was. But I'll give you a little bit of a break since you just finished talking. And the two questions you asked, Andrea, are really important. The significance and the symbolism, what I've realized of the communities all across the United States is it's immense. One of the ways that I stumbled across this is reading through the African American press. A lot of people don't realize that there were Black writers and journalists and reporters and kind of civic leaders that they would give speeches across the United States at different events, and you can find references to Maryland communities, Nicodemus, Kansas, Mound Bayou, Mississippi, Dr. Booker T. Washington, in many of his speeches would actually list these communities, and that's how I started finding out about them. Was reading Dr. Washington's speeches, and he said, well, there's a community in Maryland, and I was like, well, where is that? I got to go see that. And it had the same effect at the time. It took longer, of course. Now we're working with Zoom and TikTok and all these things where we can immediately broadcast this, but it was a tremendous boost for these folks. And then the other question, the reason that I use the term in my title about muted is that, of course, and we've all pointed this out, is how suppressed and oppressed these folks were. But after emancipation, it's pretty amazing. That's why I started keeping notes, Melissa, about what's the difference between a settlement and a village and because each one of them would use either a church or a school or a church and a cemetery as a physical expression that we're here and we count now, and we're going to keep counting, keep our presence and grow from there.
Yeah. I will just follow up on that. I have been thinking about the work that you did, all that sleuthing without, before the internet, and
Right.
just how meticulous and tenacious you had to be to uncover these landscapes. Because even in the digital age, they can be muted places, hard to, pulling together every little scrap. But along the lines of the question of, the transition period, I think sometimes I see the towns or settlements kind of popping up out of nowhere, and they're not popping up out of nowhere, particularly in the region I was describing, where, we have 1,600 enslaved people living there, right? Emancipation comes and many stay. And so that's why, we sort of see this kind of towns are just like, aren't there, suddenly there. But the community was already there for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Everett. Sorry.
No, since I have, such an agreeable panel sitting here, one of the things I wanted to point out, Melissa, you mentioned about the oral history, and I think a lot of people assume that if you don't have 100-year-old centenarian, you're not going to get information or anything that's really authentic or valuable. But recently, within the last 2 weeks, I'm working on a project here in Texas, and we found a church historian, an African-American church historian, who happens to be, I don't think she'll mind me saying, she's kind of in her early 60s, but she had taken upon herself, the way she became the church historian. She grew up in the church, that specific church, and she took it upon herself to talk to the elders while she was growing up. And she kept notes.
Oh.
And sure enough, some of the elders had scrapbooks. And so she began to, and so she began to kind of like build her own scrapbook with cross references. And she showed us the first 3 churches. This church evolved, and it's just like you described. The first church was essentially built out of surplus lumber from a plantation, and then they used the lumber from the first church to build the second church. This kind of before modern environmental awareness and consciousness, reusing material. But she got the elders to describe what these church buildings look like. How many pews could you get in it? And they use that as a point of reference. And this lady actually made, we have photographs of it, she actually made little cardboard models of the churches. And so even though she's not 100 years old, she has this amazing collection of this church history. And I just want to remind people that whoever's in that church or in that congregation or in that group, if you'll sit down and talk to them, they will provide you leads many times to information that's really reliable and really important.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And that actually, one of the things that I think stands out so much in both of your work is the interdisciplinary aspects of it, and how you've really used all kinds of disciplines and ways of studying this. Is there something that you want to kind of say about that, the importance of that, or perhaps some of the challenges in really trying to find the history and these patterns and the different methods that you've used to work on that?
Melissa, do you want to start, or you want me to?
I always want to listen to you.
Oh.
I have stuff to say, but
Okay. So yeah. Well, again, I talked about this, a year ago when I gave my talk for the GSD, but my mentor was J.B. Jackson, and of course, Jackson wasn't a traditional. You couldn't say he was a traditional architect or whatever, but he was a keen scholar of interdisciplinary work, And he just had a way of explaining to me how important, that would be. So in your case, Melissa, when I got to Montgomery County in Maryland, and somebody said that there was this person named George McDaniel, I said, okay, I got to find him and just let him guide me and, and lead me. And then, of course, I'm from San Antonio, and historic archaeology is a big issue here, a big deal. So I have grown up, literally watching the past be uncovered and preserved here in our community. And so I just took those things, kind of those learning experiences, and sure enough, it has turned out to be the way to do this work. And then, of course, the archivists, I've had tremendous opportunities when I was doing my base work to actually be able to spend literally months in the National Archives and the Library of Congress. And the archivists, I don't know if they'll do this anymore, but the archivists at the National Archives, I kept coming back day after day after day, and they got tired of me coming. And so finally they would actually lock me into the, into the stacks and let me out in the afternoon. And but that's where I started finding, for example, in Montgomery County, one archivist would say, oh, there's a map just like that one you showed, and it had the name of the African-American person. And then they said, well, where's the census record for that? And then they helped me figure out where that was. And then they even exposed me to things like there are, believe it or not, postal records, post office, postal service records. And they explained to me how the mail was delivered in the early 1800s in Montgomery County. And that if I could find that mail person's delivery route, then that would help me figure out where these communities and settlements and people lived. So once I had that experience, I said, this is the way to do it. And it just grown from there. And it's really great to get to work with folks of different disciplines and learn from them. And, because that's what you have to do when you don't have kind of the privileged documentation of everybody's name is on the deed and everybody's name is on the on the census roll, etc. You just have pieces of information. And I really hope that we can encourage young folks to, get to do this. I wish I could have had, digital access, 40 years ago. And there's so much you can do with that today.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to add something, Melissa?
Sure. I would just, following up on that very thought, I approach a lot of this from the perspective of public history and leading student-led projects related to these communities. And I'm just really astounded by how, Montgomery County is a highly suburbanized, fast-growing county, extremely diverse. People from all over the globe live there now, and just how powerful some of the more recently arrived folks, when they can connect to this story, what it means to them, from people struggling with being undocumented and connecting with people who were denied so many things and had to attend segregated schools and finding points of connection. That's just one example, but I just feel there's a real power in trying to bridge between the descendant community who has living memories of growing up in these towns to the new future stewards, I hope, of these lands.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, and Melissa, I really like how you in your paper talk about how these settlement patterns were significantly different from the white communities that surrounded them. And I wonder if this is this really something that we see more nationally? And in particular, I mean, I study the history of New York, so I can't help but wonder, like, would this have been the same in Seneca Village or Weeksville? Or is this also regional to some extent? And I would assume that perhaps also the type of labor that they're doing in these communities would have a big impact on them. But I'd love to hear a little bit about that. And that also brings me to one of the first questions that came in. And I know that this has been answered, but in the chat, but Nicole Piepenbrink asked Everett, what is the name of the largest slave owner in Massachusetts you received documentation about? And so I believe that was the Lloyd family, right? So I don't know if you want to maybe include that as well, and kind of thinking about slavery in the North and how the patterns there may have been very similar or different.
Sure. The question about the slave owner in Massachusetts, it's the Isaac Royal House in Medford. The house in the slave quarters was built in 1732, and it is on the National Register of Historic Places. And just as Michael Twitty talked about in his keynote, they're trying to figure out how to express or represent the slave landscape that would have existed or could have existed around the quarters. They've been working at the main house, of course, because they have all those records and all that documentation, but it's listed on the National Register, and you can look that up. The settlement patterns, you're really bringing back memories. I remember, I guess about 10 years after I did the Northeastern Montgomery County study, I was asked to come back, and I'm trying to remember the community, it'll come to me. And they were trying to figure out why the African-American house didn't face, it was Martin's Lane. That's where it was, in Martin's
Rockville.
Lane. And they were, yes, in Rockville. And they were trying to figure out why the African-American house didn't face what was now the current asphalt, concrete, paved street. And so we went back to the maps and so forth, and kind of by interpolation figured out that the house faced the 1880s road so that the folks in the house could see who was coming. Mm-hmm. Think about it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so, Andrea, the question, as I worked across the country, I kept seeing houses, churches, and even cemeteries set back off of the road. And that became one of my oral interview questions, is why is the house so far back, or why is the church so far back? And almost to an answer, the folks would have told me that they did it on purpose. It was like a defensive planning, because if we've got 2 or 3 here in San Antonio, and there's a question coming up about San Antonio, but we've got 2 or 3 where the cemeteries are set off, the African-American cemeteries are set back off the road. And we have found the family descendants, and they said that the oral history is that they were afraid if they put the cemetery right adjacent to the road, it would be vandalized, just like we're talking about these modern occurrences. And so it was on purpose, and some of them are 200 yards off the road. And so that's what makes it so difficult now to find them. And I had another one, it was set so far off of the road that a new highway bypass was put in, and it cut off the original lane, as they called it, the lane that connected the cemetery to the rural road. And so the family had lost their bearings, they had lost their landmarks, how to get to the cemetery. And so I sat down with one of the older family members and asked him to describe, how do you get to the cemetery? Did you get to the cemetery when you were a boy? And he did that. I took notes, and then I went back to a series of maps, looking for the hills and the features that he described, and we were able to find the cemetery. And it's embedded now. It's embedded in a 70-acre tract of land that would have never found. But the cemetery was placed off of the road for defensive purposes and protection. And I have found that to be the case across the United States. So it's not just exclusive to the South or exclusive to Maryland. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Melissa, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I noticed the pattern of church, schoolhouse, cemetery, hall, that is widely dispersed. And the meaning of those places, you will find has, each one is elaborately unique, of course. But when you come and hear from the descendant communities about everything from birth to death, this is where, when the outside world was denying us so much, we learned, the schoolhouses are the roots of Black excellence, right? The churches weren't just sites of worship, but where adults learned leadership and were given the opportunities that they were denied elsewhere. So I think that kind of the meaning you will find thematically spreading very far.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I'm looking. Just interrupt me if you need to, Andrea. I'm looking at that question about Afro-descendants in the Mexican period of San Antonio history, and absolutely we were here. And I don't want to start a political debate on your discussion this morning, but landmarks such as the Alamo, the symbol of Texas liberty, there were African Americans at the Alamo, enslaved African Americans at the Alamo, but many people do not know that there were free African Americans before the Alamo, and they were Texas patriots. They fought and served the Texas Army or militia, and there were African Americans in the settlement period, the 1700s settlement period of San Antonio. And so we're working, there are different groups here. Our Historic Preservation Office has been working, several grassroots coalition groups have been working, to expose that. But definitely we were here, and here in big ways.
And that's Pauline Kolstad Gonzalez's question, right?
Yes.
About San Antonio history. Thank you for that. We also have a question from Diane Ellen Jones, who asks, Melissa, what forms of labor did these farms use?
Well, Max Trevino was presenting yesterday, and he has written an entire book about the labor systems in this region of Maryland. And so before the Civil War, of course, it's a mosaic. It's a jumble of labor systems there are large, what we would call plantations in Maryland's Piedmont, enslavement up to 50, people. But then there's just an embracing of sort of smaller scale enslavement that is intermittent, right? So if you track one farm over time, you see, and if it stays in the same family, you'll see them enslaving 2-3 individuals, and 10 years later, none, 10 years later, 2-3 individuals. And you realize that they're balancing wage labor and enslaved labor and family-based labor. So if the boys are old enough to help, so, and it's brutal. And Barbara Jean Fields has covered this ground very, very well for Maryland, how brutal that kind of mash of labor systems really was on the people who endured them, because it meant that your ability to try to establish any sense of community was extremely thwarted by the unstableness of it all. So I think that, for the sort of pre-Civil War, post-bellum, many folks are laborers. They're working in many cases on farms where they might have been enslaved. But again, it's those land acquisitions that allow the community to start to farm on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's another question for you that I think follows up well on this. It's by Norbert Halter, who asks, For Melissa, when you mentioned in taking us through a map of a settlement marked with red dots of a town or towns, buildings, you were commented there was no grid in these cases. Could you comment more on the layout of these buildings?
Again, that slide I was showing you was survey work completed by George McDaniels. Mostly, I believe that's all his early survey work indicating those homesteads. And I'm calling it sort of this dispersed landscape pattern. And I think, too, it's just getting land where you can, right? If it's someone who has a substantial property and can carve out a piece for you, then you're there. You want to be nearby. Are you negotiating with sympathetic white people who might be willing to sell you land? And so you don't have, great deal of control in these sort of rural areas of saying, what's our town going to look like? And then you see the more established white-dominated towns in the area really, and sometimes embracing that kind of, market town grid pattern, civic resources that sort of centralized. So it's very different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right on the money. The other thing that I have learned, and especially when I get to talk with the folks that have lived in the area, is again, think about the time period that you're looking at. And so these folks were more than we realize. And again, Michael Twitty talked about it in his keynote. They were very keenly aware of what we would call environmental conditions. Which way is the prevailing wind? Which direction do the big storms come from? Are you on a hill? Are you near a creek or a bottom or a mash, as you talked about? I mean, those were really big issues, and they didn't care about being on an artificial grid. They were trying to figure out how to keep from flooding or how to orient the house so that they could get the cross breezes. All those kind of basic environmental things. And I think that's an important. Those are important aspects for us to continue to include in our documentation, so folks can understand. I mean, this is a great question. Especially when you get into, like you mentioned, Melissa, you get into preservation and conservation, and you say, oh well, we'll move that house. Well, you got to face it the same direction. It's oriented the same way. It's got to be on a similar type of topography. Otherwise, you lose all of those aspects which is what I get into with the cultural landscape and the vernacular landscape. The same terms that you use, Melissa.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask Everett a question?
Yeah.
I was captured by the phrase, when you were talking about skills, and you said, we would even call this the skill of urban planning. And I really took to that. I see that as I dig around these domestic outbuildings and realize, just how amazingly complex they are with understanding hydrology and temperature and climate control and prevailing winds and the path of the sun and all those things. I wonder, my question is, when you tell people that, when you say, listen, these folks were urban planners, do you get pushback on, well, where's your concrete proof?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's and the pushback only makes me work harder. I a little bit, if you'll indulge me just a little bit. So again, I'm, like I said, I'm from Texas, and my grandparents lived in Northeast Texas in Nacogdoches County, and they died within 20 miles of where they were born. And my mom used to send me in the summers to stay with my grandparents, my granddad and my grandmother, on their little farm. And so there was nothing to do in the afternoons or the evenings but listen to them explain all of these things. Why is the well located where it's located? Why is the house situated where it's situated? And so all I can tell you is I know from firsthand experience that those are real considerations. And all the things. I mean, it's great. The things. I mean, I'm a product of classical planning and architectural training, and I still do things. Referencing to the modern architectural movement and Daniel Burnham and all the great masters. But when I get to these communities, that gets put on the side because these are a whole different world than all of that. All of that. Whatever you want to call it, diaspora motif, etc. And if you can't open your mind to appreciate and understand that, you're really going to miss the point. And I think planners and designers especially should be sensitive to that. If you're going to call yourself a planner or designer, you should be able to listen and understand different settings, different contexts, different cultures, and not just one. That's why I think, Melissa, we've lost so many, like you say, so many landscapes and so many structures and resources, is this kind of sweeping hand, mentality that we can just erase everything and nothing that happened before this is important.
Yeah, and quote unquote professional preservation practices,
right? Yes,
that have in many cases been to the detriment of Black landscapes, and that's
exactly.
still going on. Speaking of Texas,
tell me about it.
Dr. Andrea Roberts, Texas Freedom Colonies Project, she is articulating very powerfully what is broken in our national preservation system when it comes to a stronger federal level effort to recognize and preserve these places.
Yeah, she's doing important work.
Thank you for that. Michael Twitty wrote a comment that I just want to share with you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. He wrote, it's very challenging because Maryland has hidden much of its Southern history and relevance to patterns found in the former Confederacy is very obfuscated. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Absolutely. I think too, it's the tremendous, sort of growth and suburbanization, particularly in places like Montgomery County, where so much has been wiped off the landscape. Not just Black rural landscapes, but white rural landscapes have been, leveled. And so when you tell many of these more recent arrivals, my students, Montgomery County, lots of folks consider that part of the South. No. And we debate about where exactly is that line. Currently, they tell me, you got to be all the way down in Southern Maryland, somewhere around Charles or County or St. Mary's. And that's where it starts becoming the South. But I'm like, hold on a minute. So, yeah, I think that it's like a lack of just basic historical knowledge. And two, just the myth making Max Gravino was talking about yesterday, right? That myth making happened in full force in Maryland, and in the Piedmont in particular. We were industrious farmers. Many of us were PA German. Slavery wasn't here. That's for real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, I completely agree. And stay tuned, Michael. There's more to come. It's been pretty amazing to see, what's happened in the last couple of years, and more awareness, about this, the issue with the Confederacy, the symbolism implied and direct, and it's not just, it's here in Texas. It's all over. So yes, I completely agree. But once again, if we can, it's obvious Michael's going to keep doing what he's doing. And I would encourage Melissa, you as well, if we keep working, and, maybe we can compare some notes, as we go forward. And I'm really with you with the students, helping them understand and recognize this, because once again, to me, it would be important if they're going to be future preservationists, designers, decision makers, the awareness really needs to be increased, because the damage from that mentality, that white supremacist Confederate mentality is it's been enormous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We are getting close to the end of our session. I don't know if you have anything that you'd want to add before we leave. I mean, I know we could continue this conversation for a very long time, I think. But do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
I'll just say thanks again, everyone. And if people want to get involved, they absolutely can. Please contact me. These sites need direct help. And you don't have to be in Maryland to have an impact on the preservation of these places.
There's African American and indigenous, of course, but African American culture embedded, and there are traces in every state in the continental United States. So you're right, Melissa, you don't have to be just in Maryland. There are projects and causes, important projects and causes in every state. It's just a matter of getting engaged and being persistent. It's not for the faint of heart. You won't get instant results all the time, but over time it'll add up, and it'll help us all as Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much both for all your work, for sharing that with us today. And thank you to the audience for really great questions. I look forward to the rest of the afternoon. I think we have a break now. So thank you.
Thanks.
You. Bye.